July 9th, 1755. 10 miles east of Fort Duquesne, in the densely forested wilderness of western Pennsylvania. General Edward Braddock, a 60-year-old British career officer with nearly half a century of service to the Crown, commanded the largest military force Britain had yet assembled in North America. His objective seemed straightforward: capture Fort Duquesne, the French stronghold at the forks of the Ohio River, and break France's grip on the strategic waterways that controlled access to the vast interior of the continent. What Braddock could not have imagined as his 1,300 men crossed the Monongahela River that sweltering summer morning was that he was marching toward one of the most catastrophic defeats in British military history, a slaughter so complete that it would fundamentally alter how European armies fought in the New World. Braddock's force comfortably outnumbered the attackers they would soon face Wikipedia. But numbers alone would prove meaningless against an enemy that fought by rules Braddock had never encountered. The British general had spent his entire military career on the parade grounds and garrison posts of England and the Low Countries. He understood warfare as it was practiced in the open fields of Europe, where armies met in clear sight of each other, formed neat lines of infantry, and exchanged volleys of musket fire until one side broke and ran. The dense forests of North America, where visibility extended only yards and the very terrain conspired against European military doctrine, might as well have been another planet. Benjamin Franklin had personally warned Braddock of the dangers awaiting him in the wilderness Wikipedia. The famous printer and inventor had met with the general in Frederick, Maryland, to discuss logistics for the expedition. Franklin cautioned that the long, narrow column Braddock's army would form during the march made it vulnerable to ambush by French allied Indians who excelled at forest warfare. Braddock had smiled at Franklin's concern and replied with the supreme confidence of a European professional soldier that while these savages might trouble raw colonial militia, they could make no impression on the king's regular and disciplined troops. That dismissive arrogance would cost Braddock his life and nearly 1,000 of his men theirs. The expedition had been grueling from the start. The army had progressed slowly from Fort Cumberland, cutting a road as they moved toward the forks of the Ohio, George Washington's Mount Vernon. Every yard of that road had to be carved through virgin forest, a painstaking process that allowed the army to advance only a few miles each day. The physical toll was immense. The troops subsisted on salt beef that caused scurvy. Horses died in shocking numbers from lack of forage. Supplies rotted in the heavy rains that turned the primitive trail to mud. Young George Washington, serving as one of Braddock's aides despite being racked with fever, had tried repeatedly to convince the general to adapt his tactics to American conditions. Braddock refused. His men would fight as British soldiers had always fought, in disciplined ranks with fixed bayonets. The French commander at Fort Duquesne, Captain Claude-Pierre Pecaudy de Contrecoeur, faced a desperate situation. His garrison consisted of only about 250 French Marines and Canadian militia, with about 640 Native American allies camped outside the Fort Wikipedia. Braddock's artillery would reduce the wooden fortification to splinters within hours. Contrecoeur's only hope was to strike first, to hit the British column before it could deploy its cannons and superior numbers. He dispatched Captain Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu with roughly 800 men, a mix of French regulars, Canadian militia, and warriors from multiple tribes including Ottawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi nations. These Indians had been fighting in the forests of North America for generations. They knew tactics that European military academies had never conceived. Around 1 p.m. on that fateful July afternoon, the lead elements of Braddock's column, an advance guard of 300 grenadiers and colonial troops under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, suddenly encountered Beaujeu's force on the forest trail. Beaujeu, dressed in war regalia, complete with war paint, turned and waved his hat chronoscaph. The signal unleashed a wild war whoop from hundreds of Indian warriors and a sharp volley of fire from the trees ahead. For a few moments it seemed the British might prevail through sheer firepower. Gage's men wheeled into line with impressive steadiness and returned fire in deliberate volleys. The third British volley killed Beaujeu while fire from Gage's 2 field pieces drove back some of the Native American warriors' chronoscaph. But then the true nightmare began. The French officer, Captain Jean-Daniel Dumas, rallied the remaining troops and Indians. The key difference between European and Native American warfare now revealed itself in the most brutal fashion possible. The Native Americans streamed through the forest along both flanks of the British, and poured a deadly fire upon the Redcoats' chronoscaph. This wasn't warfare as Braddock's men understood it. The Indians didn't stand in neat ranks to be shot at. They used every tree, every rock, every fold in the ground as cover. They moved constantly, making them nearly impossible targets for soldiers trained to aim at massed formations. Most of the British regulars were not accustomed to fighting in forest terrain, and instead of scattering, they maintained tight formations that the Indians and French could easily target Wikipedia. The crimson coats that made British soldiers look so impressive on European battlefields now served as perfect aiming points for warriors firing from concealment. The Indians employed psychological warfare that was as effective as their marksmanship. Warriors nailed the scalps of dead British soldiers to trees and made a terrifying whoop sound that caused fear and panic to spread among British troops' Wikipedia. The sounds of war whoops echoing through the forest, the sight of comrades falling with no visible enemy to shoot at, the scalps of fellow soldiers hanging from nearby trees, it shattered the nerve of men who had never experienced anything remotely similar. The narrow confines of the forest road became a killing ground. Confusion reigned, and several British platoons fired on each other Wikipedia. Gage's advance guard, taking heavy casualties, began to fall back. They collided with the main body of Braddock's force, which had rushed forward when they heard the shooting. The entire column dissolved into a panicked mass of men crowded onto a narrow trail, hemmed in by forest on both sides, taking fire from an enemy they could not see. Officers tried desperately to restore order, but the chaos was complete. The cannons that should have been Britain's decisive advantage couldn't be effectively deployed in the dense woods. There was simply no room to manoeuvre them, no clear field of fire. At this time, French regulars began advancing along the road and began to push the British back Wikipedia. Braddock rode forward repeatedly trying to rally his men, his courage never in question even as his judgment proved fatally flawed. He refused to allow his troops to take cover behind trees, seeing such behaviour as cowardice unbefitting British soldiers. He wanted his men to stand in formation and deliver volleys, the tactics that had won battles in Flanders and the Low Countries, but those tactics were suicide in the American forest. The enemy's bullets came from everywhere and nowhere. British soldiers who tried to fight from behind cover were ordered back into the killing ground of the road by their own officers. For 3 hours the slaughter continued. The British fired thousands of rounds into the forest, their volleys crashing through the trees to strike nothing but wood and leaves. Meanwhile, aimed fire from concealed positions cut down redcoat after redcoat. Of the 1,459 British troops actively engaged, almost 1,000 were killed or wounded, Encyclopaedia Britannica. The officer casualties were particularly devastating. Officers on horseback made obvious targets, and warriors specifically targeted them to decapitate the British command structure. Braddock himself was finally hit, a bullet passing through his chest. Mortally wounded, he would die 4 days later during the retreat. As British cohesion finally collapsed completely, the survivors broke and ran. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned their weapons, their equipment, even their wounded comrades in their panic to escape the killing ground. George Washington, who had 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullets passed through his coat, helped organize the remnants of the force Wikipedia. The young Virginian would later write that he witnessed behavior from British regular troops that showed more cowardice than he could have imagined possible. These were the same soldiers who had earlier disdained colonial troops as inferior. Now they fled in disorder while some of the colonial troops tried to fight from cover and protect the retreat. The Battle of the Monongahela, as it became known, represented a watershed moment in North American military history. The defeat awakened British military leadership to a harsh reality. The inability of the British to use skirmishers and the vulnerability this caused for the main force had a profound effect on British military thinking. Wikipedia. European tactics, effective on the open battlefields of Europe, could prove suicidal in the American wilderness without adaptation. More fundamentally, the battle demonstrated that Native American warriors fighting on their own terrain using their own tactics were formidable enemies who could destroy a European professional army. But what exactly were these Native American tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective? To understand this, we must recognize that woodland Indians had developed sophisticated military methods honed over generations of warfare. Indigenous woodlanders were excellent, elusive skirmishers in woodland and brush, and their marksmanship was equal to, if not superior to their colonial enemies' chronoscaph. From childhood, Indian boys trained in skills that prepared them for forest combat. They learned to move silently through the woods, to read signs that would be invisible to European soldiers, to use terrain for concealment and advantage. Hunting provided constant practice in marksmanship and stalking. The fundamental philosophy of Native American warfare differed dramatically from European concepts. A Kanawake Mohawk named Tekagrentenego stated that the art of war consists of ambushing and surprising enemies, and in preventing them from ambushing and surprising ourselves chronoscaph. This was warfare based on stealth, surprise, and individual initiative rather than massed formations and set-piece battles. Warriors typically fought in small, flexible units. There were leaders who gave advice, but during combat, every man acted according to his own judgment while maintaining the integrity of the unit. This required a level of individual skill and tactical awareness far beyond what was expected of a European soldier who simply stood in ranks and fired when ordered. Woodland Indians generally carried light muskets and were well versed in gun maintenance, moulded their own shot, and had gunsmiths resident in their villages to maintain firearms from the late 17th century chronoscaph. The stereotype of Indians armed primarily with bows and arrows was already outdated by the mid-18th century. Indians had mastered European firearms and were extremely particular about quality. They refused weapons that didn't meet their specifications and could repair and maintain their guns under field conditions. They practiced marksmanship extensively because obtaining meat depended on accurate shooting. When this skill was applied to warfare, the results were deadly. Indian tactics emphasized what colonists derisively called the skulking way of war. This involved using the forest itself as a weapon. Warriors would position themselves in cover before an engagement, often spread over a wide frontage. They would allow enemy forces to enter a killing zone before opening fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The psychological impact of being surrounded by an invisible enemy was as important as the physical casualties inflicted. Warriors understood how to use terrain, how to approach without being detected, how to coordinate attacks through signals that European soldiers wouldn't recognize. They employed fire and maneuver tactics, with some warriors maintaining fire while others repositioned to attack from a different angle. The contrast with British tactics could not have been starker. British infantry of the period were trained to fight in linear formations, standing shoulder to shoulder in ranks 2 or 3 deep. This made administration of troops easier and allowed for devastating volley fire when armies met in open terrain. The British infantry manual of the era contained detailed instructions for maintaining alignment in ranks, executing coordinated volleys, fixing bayonets, and advancing in formation. There were specific distances to be maintained between soldiers, specific timing for loading and firing sequences. British soldiers drilled endlessly to perform these maneuvers automatically. The system had proven effective on European battlefields for good reasons. Concentrated volley fire from massed infantry could break enemy formations. The threat of a bayonet charge by steady troops could cause less disciplined enemies to break and run. But in the forests of North America, these tactics became liabilities. Maintaining formation was nearly impossible in dense undergrowth. Coordinated volleys were wasted when the enemy fought from concealment, rather than standing in the open to receive fire. The bright red coats that made British regiments identifiable in the smoke and confusion of European battlefields made soldiers conspicuous targets in green forests. The emphasis on standing firm rather than taking cover meant needlessly accepting casualties. The British system was optimised for an entirely different type of warfare. To be fair, not all British officers were as blind to American conditions as Braddock. Some recognised early that adaptation was necessary. Along the frontiers of the Northern American colonies, where most battles of the French and Indian War took place, Rangers proved indispensable adjuncts to the main regular and provincial armies, both as partisan warriors and as scouts, the history reader. These Ranger companies were essentially backwoodsmen, men who lived on the frontier and knew how to operate in the wilderness. They dressed practically rather than in regulation uniforms. They fought as skirmishers rather than in formation. They could move through the forest quietly, live off the land, and employ many of the same tactics Indians used. The most famous of these units was Rogers' Rangers, commanded by Major Robert Rogers of New Hampshire. Rogers trained and commanded his own rapidly deployable light infantry force. which was tasked mainly with reconnaissance and conducting special operations against distant targets. Wikipedia. Rogers' men could travel on snowshoes in winter, navigate rivers in whaleboats, move through swamps and forests with a mobility that regular troops couldn't match. They conducted long-range raids deep into French-held territory, gathered intelligence about enemy positions and strength, and fought Indians using Indian tactics. Rogers was inspired by colonial frontiersman ranger groups across North America and codified tactics for the first time as his 28 Rules of Ranging Wikipedia. These rules formalized principles of wilderness warfare in writing, creating a doctrine for irregular operations. The rules emphasized practical measures. Don't forget nothing. Have your musket clean and ready. Don't sleep beyond dawn. When on the march, keep scouts ahead and on the flanks. Don't bunch up. Make sure you know where your men are at all times. If the enemy ambushes you, immediately return fire and charge toward them to break up their formation. These may sound like common sense, but they represented a radical departure from standard British military practice. Rogers' Rangers operated primarily around Lake George and Lake Champlain in New York, conducting raids against French forts and Indian villages throughout the war. Rogers' patrols became the only military action against the enemy during the Winter Months Warfare History Network, when regular armies went into winter quarters. The Rangers fought through all weather and conditions. They survived ambushes, conducted successful raids, and brought back vital intelligence. Not all their operations succeeded. Rangers were killed and captured, but they proved that colonial troops could fight effectively in the wilderness, and that adaptation to American conditions was both possible and necessary. The British military establishment gradually learned these lessons, though not without resistance. Lord George Howe is credited with beginning to truly promote a dedicated light infantry training regiment based on the battle tactics of the American woodland nations during the Ticonderoga campaign of 1758. Wikipedia. Howe was a British general who recognised that defeating the French and their Indian allies required learning from their methods. He sought out Rogers and other experienced frontier fighters to learn about wilderness warfare. He modified his soldiers' equipment to make them more mobile, cutting down coattails and reducing unnecessary weight. He trained his men to fight as skirmishers when necessary, taking cover and firing at individual targets rather than just standing, in ranks delivering volleys. Thomas Gage raised the 80th Regiment of Light Armed Foot in mid-1758 Encyclopedia.com, creating a British regular unit specifically trained for forest warfare. The 60th Royal Americans and the 80th Regiment represented the latest in British tactical ingenuity, trained to fight as light infantry to counter the edge in forest warfare enjoyed by the French and their Indian allies. Warfare History Network. These units were unencumbered by the typical 60 to 80 pound load carried by line infantry. They dressed in modified uniforms suited to moving through forests. They learned to fight from cover, to move in dispersed formation, to use initiative rather than waiting for orders for every action. The army adapted formation during the American Revolution by forming and fighting in looser ranks, a tactic known as loose files and American Scramble Wikipedia. Soldiers stood at greater distances apart, and different orders specified how much to expand or contract the formation as terrain required. Clayton describes how the use of light infantry, well led by their officers and NCOs, was of key importance in advance as skirmishers fired on French columns from behind cover. Wikipedia. These light troops would advance ahead of the main line in open order, using terrain for cover, maintaining destructive fire on enemy formations. When the enemy tried to respond, the light infantry could threaten them with bayonet charges or fall back to prepare for further skirmishing and ambushes. Large numbers of scouts and skirmishers were also formed from Loyalists and Native Americans. Wikipedia. The British increasingly recruited Indians as allies and integrated them into operations. They formed Loyalist Ranger units from colonists who remained faithful to the Crown. These forces could operate effectively in the wilderness and counter enemy irregular warfare. This represented a complete reversal from Braddock's approach. Rather than dismissing American methods as beneath the dignity of professional soldiers, the British military adapted and adopted those methods. The French had learned these lessons earlier than the British. When major European powers began to use light troops in the mid-18th century, they typically employed them in a manner of war that the French labelled La Petite Guerre, Journal of the American Revolution. The French in Canada had lived alongside Indian allies for generations and learned from them. French and Canadian forces routinely operated using tactics similar to those of their native allies, conducting raids and ambushes, using speed and manoeuvre for sudden attacks. French officers and coureurs de bois, the frontier traders and trappers, could travel and fight in the wilderness with effectiveness that British regulars initially couldn't match. But the adaptation to American conditions wasn't instantaneous or universal among British forces. The British seemed to ignore much of their experience using light infantry during the years between wars Zoboko. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, many of the ranger companies and light infantry units were disbanded. Officers went back to drilling troops in European fashion. There was institutional resistance to maintaining wilderness warfare capabilities. Some British officers saw irregular warfare as ungentlemanly, beneath the standards of professional soldiers. Others worried that training soldiers to fight as individuals in dispersed formations would undermine discipline. By the time the American Revolution began in 1775, much of the institutional knowledge about forest fighting had faded. When war broke out at Lexington and Concord, British forces found themselves once again struggling against enemies who used cover, fired at individual targets, and refused to stand in the open and fight in the European manner. The popular image of militia in the Revolution was of sniping from the woods at British soldiers in the open colonial Williamsburg. While this image is exaggerated, as most major Revolutionary War battles were fought using linear tactics by both sides, the retreat from Concord did see colonial militia using cover effectively to inflict casualties on British regulars marching in column. When Sullivan's expedition against the Iroquois prepared in 1779, troops trained in the woods, defiles, swamps and hills, practicing pre-planned actions to immediately respond to enemy contact with Indian warriors and British irregulars' Army Historical Foundation. The Americans were prepared to deny the enemy their greatest advantage when fighting in the forest: the element of surprise. Rifle corps dispersed considerably in front with orders to reconnoitre ahead to prevent ambush. This showed that Americans had learned the lessons that British forces had taken so long to absorb. The Native American impact on American military traditions extended far beyond the colonial period. The famous Robert Rogers arrived in England after the war and published his own account of his exploits in London in 1765, solidifying his reputation American battlefield trust. His Rangers and their methods became legendary. During the Revolution, many Continental Army leaders had served with Ranger units during the earlier war. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, some colonial militia units were led by veterans of Rogers Rangers, including John Stark, ww.army.mil. These men brought with them knowledge of irregular warfare that proved valuable against British forces. The broader cultural impact of Native American military methods on colonial and early American society was profound. The frontier experience fundamentally shaped American attitudes toward warfare. The emphasis on individual initiative, the willingness to adapt tactics to circumstances, the focus on marksmanship and fieldcraft, all became part of American military culture. This stood in contrast to the European emphasis on rigid discipline, adherence to doctrine, and the subordination of individual action to formation and command structure. Understanding the encounter between British Redcoats and Native American ambush tactics also requires recognizing the brutality of 18th century frontier warfare. This wasn't warfare governed by the codes and conventions that European armies theoretically observed. Warfare on the frontiers of North America between colonists and Indians during the 18th century often involved brutal tactics, including attacking and burning villages and homes, destroying crops, and killing or capturing non-combatants. Journal of the American Revolution. This type of warfare impacted entire societies, not just military forces. It was total war in a way that European conflicts often tried to avoid. Native American war parties captured British soldiers who lagged behind the main column and nailed their scalps to trees ahead of the column as a warning to other British soldiers perdue. The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. Captives were sometimes tortured, not merely from cruelty but as part of cultural practices that demonstrated courage and inflicted revenge for losses suffered. After the Battle of the Monongahela, around a dozen British soldiers were tortured and burned to death by Indians that night. Wikipedia, witnessed by American prisoners. These acts horrified European soldiers unfamiliar with such practices. But it's crucial to note that cruelty wasn't one-sided. Colonial and British forces conducted raids on Indian villages that killed non-combatants, destroyed food supplies, and burned homes. Rogers assembled 200 rangers and struck deep into enemy territory, surprised the Abenaki, killed many of them, and destroyed their village US history in retaliation for Abenaki raids on British settlements. The cycle of raid and counter-raid, massacre and revenge characterized much of the frontier conflict. From the Native American perspective, they were defending their lands and way of life against European encroachment. The French and Indian War was part of a longer struggle over control of North America's interior. The Native American mastery of forest warfare stemmed from lifelong immersion in wilderness skills. Warfare and hunting were exclusively male activities among Great Lakes tribes, and a man's position and stature within Indian society often rested on his abilities and accomplishments as a hunter and warrior. Milwaukee Public Museum. Boys grew up learning to track game, to move silently, to read the forest. These same skills applied directly to warfare. A warrior needed to understand terrain, weather, the behavior of game and humans. He needed physical endurance to cover long distances on foot, often carrying heavy loads. He needed courage to close with enemies in combat. He needed the judgment to know when to fight and when to withdraw. When an Indian war party of any size began an attack, each warrior generally fought on his own Milwaukee Public Museum. This individualistic approach to combat contrasted sharply with European methods. Indian communities had definite goals for war parties, but once combat started, Indian men sought to gain recognition through personal bravery and achievement. Killing an enemy warrior brought honor and status. This made warfare a more personal activity for Indians than for Europeans who fought in units under close supervision. It also meant that Indian war parties would often retreat if the tide of battle turned against them, since preserving warriors was more important than holding ground. The tactical implications of this approach were significant. Indian forces could disperse and reassemble quickly. They could break off an engagement and melt into the forest when conditions became unfavourable. They fought when they held advantage and avoided decisive battles when they didn't. This frustrating British commanders who wanted to force the Indians into stand-up fights where European superiority in numbers and equipment could prove decisive. But the Indians simply wouldn't cooperate. They fought on their own terms, and in the forests of North America those terms heavily favoured them. The British adaptation to American conditions proceeded unevenly and faced resistance throughout. Some British officers embraced the lessons of wilderness warfare enthusiastically. Others clung to European methods and regarded irregular warfare as disreputable. Recent historians have questioned conventional wisdom and blamed Braddock's defeat more on the general's faulty execution of European tactics than on using European tactics at all HistoryNet. Braddock had failed to use skirmishers properly, an established European tactic. He had posted flanking companies, but they weren't trained to function as proper light troops. He had egregiously misused his Indian scouts and refused offers to add more Indian allies to his force. In other words, Braddock failed not because he used European tactics, but because he failed to use them properly and refused to adapt to circumstances. This interpretation suggests that the problem wasn't European military methods per se, but inflexibility and arrogance. Competent European commanders facing irregular opponents in rough terrain knew to use light troops, to secure their flanks to avoid being caught in column in vulnerable positions. Braddock knew these things in theory but failed to apply them. His contempt for his opponents, his overconfidence in British regular troops, and his inexperience in actual combat all contributed to the disaster. A more flexible, experienced commander with the same resources might have achieved a different outcome. But even granting this point, the Battle of the Monongahela demonstrated conclusively that Native American warriors were formidable military opponents, whose methods, whatever European theorists might think of them, were devastatingly effective in their own terrain. The Indians at the Monongahela weren't simply guerrillas, harassing a superior force. They decisively defeated a European professional army, inflicting casualties that would have been considered catastrophic on any battlefield. They demonstrated tactical sophistication, coordination, and fighting skills that matched or exceeded those of European soldiers. The long-term legacy of this encounter between British Redcoats and Native American forest fighters shaped American military development for generations. The Ranger tradition that emerged from Rogers and other frontier leaders eventually evolved into specialized light infantry and reconnaissance units. Modern US Army Rangers trace their lineage directly back to Rogers Rangers and the colonial ranger companies. The emphasis on adaptability, initiative, and specialized skills for operating in difficult terrain became enduring characteristics of American military culture. For the Native Americans, their victories in the French and Indian War proved Pyrrhic in the long run. Despite their military effectiveness, they couldn't halt the tide of European settlement. The French were eventually defeated and forced to cede Canada to Britain in 1763. Indian tribes found themselves caught between British and colonial interests, their lands increasingly encroached upon regardless of their military prowess. The very tactics that had proven so effective against Braddock couldn't stop the demographic and economic forces transforming North America. Superior tactics couldn't compensate for overwhelming numbers and resources arrayed against them. The story of British Redcoats facing Native American ambush tactics is ultimately one of cultural collision, military adaptation, and the high cost of underestimating one's enemies. Braddock's defeat shocked the British establishment and forced a reckoning with American realities. The British Army eventually learned to fight effectively in North American conditions by combining European discipline with American frontier methods. They created light infantry units, recruited ranger companies, employed Indian allies, and modified their tactics for forest warfare. This adaptation took years and cost thousands of lives, but it eventually allowed British forces to operate successfully in the wilderness. For the soldiers who fought these battles, whether British regulars struggling to see their invisible enemies, Indian warriors defending their homelands, rangers adapting to a new kind of warfare, or colonial troops caught between European and American methods, the experience was terrifying and transformative. Men trained for one kind of combat found themselves in another entirely. Those who survived had to learn quickly or die. The forest warfare of the French and Indian War forged new tactical approaches and created military traditions that would shape conflicts for generations to come. July 9th, 1755, was a day of reckoning that began a process of military evolution, bought with blood in the forests of Pennsylvania. The lessons learned in blood along the Monongahela River didn't immediately translate into widespread change throughout the British Army. Military institutions, particularly in the 18th century, were deeply conservative organisations resistant to innovation that challenged established doctrine. The British Army had spent centuries perfecting linear tactics that had proven effective across European battlefields, from Marlborough's victories at Blenheim and Ramillies to more recent triumphs in the War of Austrian Succession. Senior officers who had built their careers mastering these methods weren't eager to abandon them based on setbacks in what many still considered a backwater theatre of operations. The immediate aftermath of Braddock's defeat saw finger-pointing and attempts to shift blame rather than serious tactical reform. Some British officers blamed colonial troops for breaking first, though this contradicted eyewitness accounts that showed regular troops panicking while some provincial soldiers fought effectively from cover. Others blamed the Indians for fighting in an uncivilized manner, as if the enemy had some obligation to accommodate British tactical preferences. Still others focused on Braddock's personal failures while insisting that proper application of conventional methods would have succeeded. This resistance to acknowledging that fundamental adaptation was necessary delayed the evolution of British tactical doctrine. However, field commanders who actually had to fight in North America couldn't afford such denial. They faced an immediate practical problem. How do you defeat an enemy who won't stand and fight in the open, who uses terrain you can barely navigate, who appears and disappears like ghosts? The answer required looking beyond British military traditions to learn from those who understood American warfare, the colonists who lived on the frontier, and the Indians themselves. The ranger companies that emerged represented the first serious British attempt to fight fire with fire. These weren't regular British troops with slight modifications. They were fundamentally different forces organised, equipped and employed according to entirely different principles. A ranger company might consist of only 50 to 100 men, a tiny fraction of a regular infantry regiment. They didn't wear standard uniforms but practical clothing suited to wilderness travel. They carried lighter loads, moved faster, and operated with far more independence than regular troops. Most importantly, they recruited men who already possessed wilderness skills rather than trying to train conventional soldiers in unfamiliar methods. Robert Rogers himself exemplified this new type of soldier. Born in 1731 in Massachusetts and raised on the New Hampshire frontier, Rogers grew up hunting, trapping, and learning wilderness survival. He knew how to navigate by the stars, how to move silently through the forest, how to read tracks and signs that would be invisible to someone raised in England. When war came, these weren't skills he had to learn, they were second nature. Rogers was also a natural leader who understood how to organise and command men in fluid situations, where rigid discipline and adherence to orders wouldn't work. The 28 rules of ranging that Rogers codified deserve closer examination, because they represent a systematic attempt to translate frontier experience into military doctrine. Rule 1 states that all rangers are to be subject to the rules and articles of war, establishing that despite their irregular methods, rangers were military units subject to military discipline. Rule 2 instructs rangers to keep themselves constantly vigilant and never sleep beyond dawn, reflecting the reality that surprise attacks typically came at first light. Rule 4 warns against marching in a single file, as this makes it easy for the enemy to track you and leaves the entire column vulnerable if the leading scouts are ambushed. Rule 10 addresses what to do if you're surrounded, advising to form a circle or square with everyone facing outward to meet the threat from any direction. Rule 13 concerns night attacks, noting that you should never attack an enemy by moonlight or daylight if you can avoid it, instead waiting for dawn when defenders will be least alert. Rule 19 describes how to organise a camp, placing sentries at a distance from the main body so they can warn of approaching enemies without leading attackers directly to sleeping men. Rule 23 advises that when you're on the march, your flanking parties should be at least 20 yards from your main body to prevent the entire force from being surprised simultaneously. These rules codified tactical wisdom learned through bitter experience. They addressed practical problems that European military manuals never considered because those problems didn't arise on European battlefields. How do you march through a forest without leaving an obvious trail? How do you organise a night march? How do you respond immediately to ambush? What do you do if you encounter a superior enemy force? Rogers' rules provided answers based on what actually worked in the American wilderness, rather than what military theory suggested should work. The Rangers' actual operations demonstrated both the potential and limitations of this approach. Rogers' most famous raid occurred in October 1759, when he led 200 Rangers on a mission to destroy the Abenaki village of St. Francis in Canada, which had served as a base for Indian raids against British settlements. The expedition required travelling 200 miles through enemy territory, crossing rivers and swamps, evading French patrols, and attacking a fortified village. The raid succeeded in surprising and destroying the village, but the return journey became a nightmare of starvation and pursuit that cost many Rangers their lives. Rogers himself barely survived, finally reaching safety with only a handful of his men after weeks in the wilderness. This operation illustrated both what Rangers could accomplish and the terrible risks they faced. Unlike regular troops who operated with supply trains and lines of communication, Rangers deep in enemy territory were entirely on their own. If they were wounded, there were no hospitals. If they ran out of food, they starved. If they were captured, they faced torture and death. The psychological demands of ranging were as severe as the physical ones. Men had to function effectively while exhausted, hungry, and constantly under threat. They had to maintain cohesion as a unit, without the rigid structure that held regular troops together. They needed initiative and judgment since officers couldn't supervise every action the way they could in a formed regiment. The British regular establishment's attitude toward Rangers remained ambivalent throughout the war. Senior commanders recognised their utility for reconnaissance and special operations, but never fully trusted them. Rangers came from lower social classes than regular officers. They didn't follow standard military protocols. Their discipline, while effective in the field, didn't conform to garrison standards. They were expensive to maintain relative to their numbers because of the specialised equipment they required and the hazardous nature of their operations. Some British officers saw them as a necessary evil rather than a model for broader tactical reform. The formation of dedicated light infantry units within the regular establishment represented a more institutionalised attempt to adapt to American conditions. These units differed from Rangers in that they consisted of regular soldiers who received specialised training rather than frontier recruits, with existing wilderness skills. The 80th Regiment of Light Armed Foot, raised in 1758, exemplified this approach. The regiment recruited from regular British troops and trained them intensively in light infantry tactics. Soldiers learned to move in open order rather than tight formations, to use terrain for cover, to fire at individual targets rather than delivering volleys, and to advance or retreat rapidly in dispersed formation. The equipment modifications for light infantry reflected their different tactical role. Coats were shortened and lightened, making movement through brush easier. Unnecessary brass and leather were removed to reduce weight and noise. Soldiers carried fewer rounds of ammunition but more practical items for field operations. Some units adopted darker-coloured uniforms that were less conspicuous than bright red coats. Headgear was modified from the standard tricorn hat to caps that didn't catch on branches. These changes seem minor but made a significant difference in soldiers' ability to operate effectively in dense forests. Training light infantry required different instructional methods than training line infantry. Line infantry drilled endlessly and precise, movements executed in unison, the goal being automatic response to commands that would function even in the chaos and terror of battle. Light infantry training emphasized individual skills and small unit tactics. Soldiers learned to judge distances, to use available cover effectively, to move quickly while maintaining contact with their unit. They practiced skirmishing in wooded terrain, responding to ambushes, and conducting reconnaissance. Officers and sergeants had to exercise different leadership styles, giving more latitude to individual soldiers while maintaining overall unit cohesion. The effectiveness of these adapted units showed clearly in engagements after 1758. At the Battle of Ticonderoga in July 1758, despite the British defeat, light infantry companies performed creditably in preliminary skirmishing. At the Battle of Quebec in 1759, British light infantry played a crucial role in the campaign, conducting reconnaissance, screening the main army's movements, and engaging French irregular forces. By 1760, when British forces finally captured Montreal and completed the conquest of Canada, light infantry and ranger units were integral parts of British operations in North America. Yet even as British forces adapted tactically, the fundamental strategic situation was being decided by factors beyond battlefield tactics. The British Navy's control of the Atlantic meant that Britain could reinforce and resupply its forces in North America, while France struggled to support its Canadian colony. British colonies had a much larger population than New France, providing more manpower and economic resources. British industrial capacity could produce more weapons, ammunition, and supplies. In essence, Britain was winning through overwhelming material superiority, even as its forces learned to fight more effectively in American conditions. The Native American allies who had been so crucial to French success early in the war gradually shifted their allegiance or withdrew from the conflict, as it became clear that France was losing. Indian tribes had fought alongside the French primarily because French presence in North America seemed less threatening to Indian interests than British colonial expansion. The French conducted trade but didn't settle in large numbers on Indian lands. British colonists, by contrast, were farmers who cleared forests and established permanent settlements that displaced Indian communities. As French power collapsed, Indian leaders had to reassess their options. Some tribes negotiated separate peace agreements with the British, extracting promises about territorial boundaries and trading rights. Others continued fighting in a losing cause out of loyalty to French allies, or hope that somehow the tide could be reversed. A few, recognizing that European victory was inevitable, focused on securing the best possible terms for their people in the new order. The reality was that regardless of their military effectiveness, Indian tribes couldn't ultimately prevail against the demographic and economic forces represented by British colonization. The conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763 marked a turning point. France ceded Canada to Britain and withdrew from North America east of the Mississippi except for a few small islands. British victory seemed complete. However, the war's end triggered new conflicts that demonstrated the enduring relevance of Native American military capabilities. Pontiac's rebellion, which erupted in 1763, saw a confederation of Indian tribes from the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley attack British forts and settlements across the frontier. Despite lacking French support, these tribes captured several British posts and laid siege to others in a campaign that showed British forces still struggled against Indian irregular warfare. The Siege of Fort Detroit, which lasted from May to October 1763, illustrated both Indian capabilities and limitations. Pontiac, an Ottawa war leader, coordinated attacks by multiple tribes against British positions throughout the region. His forces captured 8 British forts and forced the evacuation of others. At Detroit, Pontiac's warriors maintained a loose siege for months, cutting off supplies and attacking anyone who ventured outside the fortifications. British forces within the fort couldn't break the siege, but the Indians lacked artillery to breach the walls. Eventually, with winter approaching and British relief expeditions fighting their way through, the siege collapsed. The British response to Pontiac's rebellion included one of the most infamous incidents in North American military history, the deliberate use of biological warfare. Colonel Henry Bouquet, commanding British forces attempting to relieve Fort Pitt, approved a plan to give smallpox-infected blankets to Delaware emissaries under the pretext of gifts. The intent was to spread disease among Indian populations who had no immunity to European diseases. Whether this specific incident caused the smallpox epidemic that subsequently ravaged Indian communities remains debated, but the deliberate attempt to use disease as a weapon demonstrated the depths of brutality the conflict had reached. The expedition that finally ended major Indian resistance in the Ohio Valley in 1764 showed how thoroughly British forces had adapted their methods. Colonel John Bradstreet led an expedition of regular troops and provincial forces from Fort Niagara along Lake Erie, while Colonel Bouquet led another force from Fort Pitt into the Ohio country. Both expeditions employed light infantry, rangers, and Indian scouts. They moved more cautiously than Braddock had 9 years earlier, using proper reconnaissance and flank security. They avoided being drawn into ambushes and forced Indian warriors to engage on less favourable terms. The combination of improved British tactics and the exhaustion of Indian communities after years of warfare finally brought a negotiated peace. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempted to address the root causes of Indian resistance by establishing a boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains, beyond which British colonists were forbidden to settle. The Crown hoped this would placate Indian tribes and prevent further costly wars. However, colonial settlers largely ignored the proclamation, continuing to push westward into Indian territories. This became one of many grievances that poisoned relations between Britain and its American colonies, eventually contributing to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War in 1775. When that war came, both sides employed tactics learned during the French and Indian War. American forces included many veterans of earlier conflicts who understood wilderness warfare. British forces fielded light infantry companies with every regiment, and recruited loyalist ranger units like Butler's Rangers and the Queen's Rangers. Both sides employed Indian allies, though the complicated politics of the Revolution meant different tribes supported different sides based on their assessment of which offered better prospects for protecting Indian interests. The myth of Minutemen shooting from behind trees at rigidly formed British regulars marching in columns has been vastly exaggerated in American popular history. Most major battles of the Revolution were fought using conventional linear tactics by both sides. Battles like Bunker Hill, Long Island, Brandywine and Monmouth saw formed units exchanging volleys and conducting bayonet charges in the European style. However, the irregular warfare component remained significant, particularly in the Southern theatre where partisan leaders like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter conducted guerrilla campaigns using tactics that would have been familiar to French and Indian War veterans. The British forces that fought in the Revolution were much better prepared for American conditions than Braddock's army had been 20 years earlier. Every British regiment in America had light infantry companies trained in open-order tactics. British commanders understood the importance of securing their flanks and using proper reconnaissance. They recruited loyalist provincial units that could match American irregular forces. Yet they still faced many of the same challenges that had plagued British forces in the earlier war. The vast distances of North America, the difficulty of maintaining supply lines through hostile territory, the challenge of controlling population centres, while rebels controlled the countryside, these problems had no simple military solutions. For Native Americans, the Revolution proved catastrophic, regardless of which side they supported. The Iroquois Confederacy split between British and American allegiance, leading to civil war within the Confederacy and the eventual destruction of Iroquois power in New York. The devastating Sullivan Expedition of 1779, where American forces systematically destroyed Iroquois villages and crops, employed tactics similar to those used in earlier wars but on a larger scale. Major General John Sullivan's army of over 4,000 men marched through Iroquois territory, burning villages, destroying cornfields, and cutting down orchards. The aim was not just military victory, but the destruction of the enemy's capacity to sustain themselves. This represented the evolution in American military thinking about warfare against Indians. Rather than simply defeating warriors in combat, American strategy increasingly focused on destroying the economic basis of Indian society. If villages were burned, crops destroyed, and food supplies eliminated, Indian communities couldn't survive regardless of their warriors' battlefield effectiveness. This approach, horrifying in its implications, reflected a grim understanding that conventional military victory over guerrilla opponents required removing their support infrastructure. The tactics that Native American warriors had employed so effectively against Braddock in 1755 continued to pose challenges throughout the Revolution and beyond. American forces pushing westward after independence faced renewed Indian resistance in the Northwest Territory during the 1790s. The Battle of the Wabash in 1791, where a confederation of Indian tribes destroyed an American army under General Arthur St. Clair, killed over 600 American soldiers and stands as the worst defeat of US forces by Indians in American history. The tactics were familiar: surprise attack at dawn, warriors fighting from cover, psychological warfare through war cries, and the mutilation of bodies. St. Clair's poorly trained troops panicked and were slaughtered much as Braddock's had been. The American response under General Anthony Wayne showed how much had been learned. Wayne spent years training his Legion of the United States specifically to fight Indian forces. His troops drilled extensively in responding to ambushes, maintaining formation under fire, and conducting operations in forested terrain. When Wayne's Legion finally met Indian warriors at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, the Americans held their formation despite fierce attacks, used disciplined volley fire to drive back Indian assaults, and advanced with bayonets in a way that forced the Indians to retreat. Wayne had achieved what Braddock could not, maintaining unit cohesion and tactical discipline in forest combat against an elusive enemy. The broader pattern that emerged over decades of conflict was that European-derived military forces could adapt to Native American tactical methods given time, training, and proper leadership. However, this adaptation required abandoning assumptions about how warfare should be conducted and learning from enemies who were often dismissed as savages. The officers who succeeded, Rogers, Wayne, and others, were those willing to study Indian methods seriously and incorporate effective elements into their own forces while maintaining the advantages of European military organization and firepower. The technological dimension of this military evolution deserves attention. Throughout the 18th century, firearms technology remained relatively static. Both European soldiers and Indian warriors used smoothbore flintlock muskets that were accurate to perhaps 75 yards under ideal conditions and required 30 seconds or more to reload. The British Brown Bess musket that equipped British regulars throughout this period was a reliable weapon, but not particularly accurate. Its virtue was robustness. It could withstand rough handling and still function reliably. Indian warriors generally preferred lighter French fusils or trade guns that were easier to carry on long journeys through the wilderness. These weapons were less robust than military muskets, but adequate for hunting and warfare. What made Indian marksmanship effective wasn't superior weapons, but superior practice. Warriors who hunted regularly to feed their families became expert shots through constant use. They learned to judge distance, account for wind, and time their shots for maximum effect. European soldiers, by contrast, typically received minimal marksmanship training since line infantry tactics emphasized volume of fire from massed formations rather than individual accuracy. The advent of rifled weapons began changing this calculus. Rifles, with their grooved barrels that spun the bullet for accuracy, could hit targets at 200 yards or more. American frontiersmen adopted rifles enthusiastically for hunting, and rifle-armed troops appeared in both the French and Indian War and the Revolution. However, rifles had significant drawbacks. They were slower to load than smoothbore muskets, couldn't mount bayonets effectively, and were more prone to fouling. Rifle-armed troops functioned best as skirmishers and sharpshooters rather than line infantry. The psychological dimension of warfare between European and Native American forces remained crucial throughout this period. For European soldiers raised in agricultural communities, the North American wilderness was an alien and threatening environment. Dense forests where visibility extended only yards, the constant possibility of ambush, the fear of capture and torture, all created psychological stress that could break unit cohesion. The sounds of war whoops and the sight of mutilated bodies triggered primal fears that rigid discipline struggled to contain. Native American warriors faced their own psychological challenges. The concentrated firepower of formed European infantry firing disciplined volleys could be terrifying. Artillery, which Indians typically lacked, created destruction on a scale that traditional Native American warfare didn't encompass. The seemingly endless numbers of European soldiers and colonists must have created despair about the long-term prospects of resistance. As one Indian leader reportedly said, "When we kill one of them, 10 take his place. When they kill one of us, there is one less warrior." The cultural gap between European military culture and Native American warrior traditions complicated interactions even when Indians served as British allies. British officers expected allies to follow orders, maintain discipline, and subordinate personal interest to campaign objectives. Indian warriors expected to be consulted about plans, to exercise individual judgment about whether to participate in particular operations, and to pursue their own honour and interests. When Indian allies withdrew from an operation or refused to participate in ways British commanders considered critical, this was seen as unreliability. From the Indian perspective, they were exercising appropriate autonomy and making sensible tactical decisions. These cultural differences created friction that undermined cooperation even when both sides genuinely intended to work together. British officers who succeeded in leading Indian allies, like William Johnson, who lived among the Mohawks and was adopted into the tribe, did so by understanding and accommodating Indian cultural norms rather than trying to force Indian warriors into European military structures. This required a level of cultural flexibility that many British officers found impossible. The legacy of this extended period of warfare between British regular forces and Native American warriors shaped American military culture in lasting ways. The emphasis on individual marksmanship, the valorization of frontier toughness and self-reliance, the suspicion of rigid military hierarchy, the preference for informal rather than formal military bearing, all trace back to this formative period. The Ranger tradition that began with Rogers continues in modern US military special operations forces. The idea that American soldiers should be thinking individuals who exercise initiative rather than automatons who simply follow orders emerged from wilderness warfare where rigid adherence to doctrine meant death. For Native Americans, their military effectiveness ultimately couldn't prevent the loss of their lands and the destruction of their traditional ways of life. Superior tactics couldn't overcome the demographic catastrophe of European diseases that killed perhaps 90% of the indigenous population of North America. Brilliant ambush techniques couldn't defeat the economic and industrial capacity of European colonization. The tragedy of Native American history is that their warriors won many battles but lost the war, not primarily through military defeat but through disease, dispossession, and the overwhelming tide of European settlement. The story that began with Braddock's defeat in 1755 continued for another century as American expansion pushed westward, and Indian tribes fought desperate rearguard actions to preserve their territories. The tactics evolved, the weapons improved, but the fundamental pattern remained consistent. Indian warriors won, tactical victories through superior knowledge of terrain and skillful use of ambush and maneuver. American forces eventually prevailed through superior numbers, resources, and willingness to wage total war against entire Indian communities, rather than just their warriors. By the time the Indian Wars finally ended in the late 19th century, the wilderness that had been the Indians' greatest ally was largely gone. Railroads crossed the continent. Telegraph lines transmitted messages instantly. Repeating rifles and Gatling guns provided firepower that made ambush tactics suicidal. The buffalo herds that sustained Plains Indian cultures were deliberately slaughtered to force Indians onto reservations. The military methods that had served Native Americans so well in the forests of 18th century Pennsylvania had no answer to these developments. When British Redcoats first faced Native American ambush tactics in the deep forests of North America, they encountered a way of war they didn't understand and couldn't initially counter. The lessons learned in that blood-soaked education shaped military development for generations. The transformation from Braddock's disaster to Wayne's triumph represented more than tactical evolution. It represented cultural adaptation, the painful process by which one military tradition learned from another, even as the underlying strategic competition moved toward its inevitable conclusion.